My name is Tim McBride. I'm the Deputy Director of the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence here at NIST. And before we start the program, we want to thank our hosting partners with the Maryland Department of Commerce, the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, who organized this in partnership with the Cybersecurity Association of Maryland and the Maryland Tech Council. Our webcast partner is Montgomery Community Media, and our webcast sponsor is Capital One. Do I need to repeat any of that? Okay. Whoops. All right. We want to thank all of them for making the program today possible. So I'm sure many of you have been here before to this speaker series, and many of you are familiar with the NCCoE. But just to give you kind of a quick overview, the NCCoE was established in partnership with the state and county and NIST to help accelerate the adoption of secure technologies. And the approach we take to that is engaging with academia, industry, and government in defining and then resolving cybersecurity issues, which we do here in our labs. What we're going to talk about today is, as part of our speaker series, is a DHS program called the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation. And Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation is a dynamic program with a dynamic approach for fortifying the cybersecurity of federal networks and federal systems. And though it's a very federal-focused program, and the work we're doing here with DHS is very federal-focused, based on FISMA. It also has applicability, really, to any large enterprise. So we'll start the program by introducing Martin Stanley, who's the branch chief for the Cybersecurity Assurance Branch of the Department of Homeland Security, and his colleague Jim Quinn, and also a former colleague of mine, Jim Quinn, who's a lead systems engineer for the Cdm Program at DHS. And I believe if you've got the handouts, you've got their full bios. So, Jim, Martin?
It's Martin. Martin's
Okay.
a big man.
Thank you, Tim. So welcome everybody, and we're very pleased to have the opportunity to share the work that we've been doing with the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program with all of you. This is a federal civilian agency program, to be clear. DoD and the IC have their own comparable type programs. But this is a program that's focused on federal civilian agencies, and the purpose is to ensure that we have a common baseline of capabilities across federal agencies, as well as an ability to quickly understand the posture of these agencies when it comes to emerging threats. And so what we're going to do today is talk about we're going to talk about the ways in which this approach, which a considerable amount of systems engineering has gone into, could be applicable to anyone who's operating an enterprise. And if we talk a little bit about what those controls are, you'll start to see if whether it's SANS or HIPAA or whatever it happens, they're all the same controls. But they've been organized and coordinated in a structured way to achieve particular outcomes. And those are the kinds of things that Jim will be talking about later on in the presentation, so that some of those outcomes may be things that you're trying to achieve in your organization or things that you're trying to support your customers with. This is also very well documented. There's a number of system integrators as well as vendors as a result of this large federal acquisition that are conversant with the CDM approach. So it's something that's attainable through a large number of vendors as well as a result of the acquisition and our efforts. But no talk about cybersecurity would be really as effective as talking about why we're here. We're here to manage risk, and for those of you that are in the cybersecurity business, you probably find that a lot of conversations are focused on point solutions for particular problems. Well, we need to encrypt this data, or we need to, control access to this system, or whatever it happens to be. And there's little conversation about what the threats are and the impacts associated with those systems. It's a lot of focus on, I've got a list of controls, I have to go get them implemented, and we don't think about managing the risk on a more holistic basis. So there's two purposes for having this slide up here, which is stolen from 837, the Risk Management Framework, which we work very closely with NIST under the FISMA Act. FISMA was updated in 2014, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. Authorizes DHS to assist agencies in the implementation of their cybersecurity programs, OMB to issue policies for the information security programs at agencies, and then NIST to issue standards. And one of the cornerstones of the NIST 800 series is 837, the Risk Management Framework. And this is probably the single most represented graphic from 837. And it talks about the approach that federal agencies should use to manage the cybersecurity risk related to the systems that they're operating. And just to talk through, has anyone ever seen this before? Does anyone ever use it? Because that's great, because we go in and we find people talking about security controls all the time, and it's like, whatever happened to this stuff? So the first step of the risk management framework is to look at the system that you have, and based on a set of criteria, which we won't go into, really understand what the impact level of the data is, how important is that data, how important is the mission of that system, and make a determination based on all of that. How important is this system? And if the system's of high importance, you probably are going to do a lot more to protect it than ones that are not as important. The second step is to come up with a plan to protect the system, right? Select a bunch of security controls. And there's some baselines for that. We were just talking about that, right, Dave? But this should be based on that, again, the impact and the threat. So determine how important the system is and how interesting the system is to an adversary as you determine which controls you put in place. And we're going to talk specifically about how the Cdm program enables agencies and potentially other enterprises who want to adopt it to monitor how well those controls are functioning. The third step, obviously, is to implement those controls. The fourth step is to make sure that they're working, right? And then the fifth step is to then formally authorize the system. And that's a process that we go through in federal civilian agencies where we take a look at all the security work that's been done on the system. We take a look at how the system's has been built, and we make sure that the system is meeting a minimum set of criteria before the agency will turn it on. And we hope that we did a good job of that. And then lastly, once you've got the system in operation, you want to monitor the security controls to make sure that the level of assurance that you achieved here and here and here and here is still in place after the system's in operation. And we see a lot of different kinds of scenarios where systems get built really well, and then people forget to maintain them, and they don't get, and they become vulnerable as a result of emerging vulnerabilities and different kinds of tactics and techniques that the adversaries use. So all of this should be thought of in the context of what's not being discussed here is really these areas. We're going to talk about how CDM enables you to monitor the security controls that are in place in your system and understand how well they're functioning. And also to I guess the best way to describe it is when you're managing risk with respect to these systems, you have to have a target that you're trying to achieve, and you keep track of that to ensure that you're meeting the levels of assurance that you've provided to your partners and the rest of your organization. So with that, Jim, I will hand it over to you to talk about CDM itself.
Yep.
You want me to run the
Click.
clickers?
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the CDM program is somewhat a multi-part activity. There's actually a construct that we have which is called an approved products list, which is available to anyone who is a government entity, okay? So sometimes gets confused because we do have this overarching thing where we approve products that that meet our qualifications with regards to interoperability, ability to be plugged into a continuous monitoring system, as well as being able to perform certain functions that would support the underlying phase requirements that we have. That's always a background. The subset of that is the ones that almost everyone always thinks about because that's where the money is. And that is that originally in our appropriation, and now as formalized in the FSMA 2014 Act, the CDM program has the unusual authority, and it's a budgetary authority, that allows us to be able to buy on behalf of an agency in order for them to meet their needs. So we can take our money to buy things for agencies. That becomes important because that says that we can basically do a prioritization against high-level needs identified for securing the entire .gov space, and then try to apply that into the agencies as opposed to the agencies having to fight a little niche to get one cybersecurity tool. So we're doing it much more holistically. And we have a strategy that we basically took the Cdm program and initially divided it into 3 phases. The phases was actually defined by our ability to define requirements. It accidentally also turned out that the requirements did not become available on day 1, so it also in some ways influenced the order of which we awarded monies and did work. But phases, like phase 1, will continue for a long period of time because the nature of phase 1 of knowing what's on your network is just something that's going to progress. When Congress realized that and OMB, realized that we had defined all 3 phases, they said, no, you guys are not going to be able to put your feet up on the table and relax. We want you to do a 4th phase. The 4th phase is not well defined, but they said, whatever you thought you were done, you're not done. Because we have this other thing that we want you to look at, which is looking at less traditional ways of viewing how we're doing security posture, essentially. The good news is that for the work that we are currently doing, the number of participating agencies is in the order of 70 agencies within the federal civilian space, and that accounts for 97% of the population of the federal executive branch. So we're not a 50% coverage. We're as close as you can get to 100% in the fact that there's 120 some odd. There's actually an unknown number of agencies. I've never been able to get the really authoritative number because it varies from 124 to 160. But we know that there's 70 that really exist and that we're providing services for. So one of the things that happened as part of the appropriation was Congress added a little bit of a task onto our program office. They says, it's great that you're buying these tools. It's great that you've written requirements. We want to know at end of day, did this actually have the result that we're looking for that showed that you were improving the cybersecurity posture of that agency? Towards that end, we created a dashboard, and that dashboard mechanisms is basically deployed in each agency, and we have a federal model, and it's all one integrated dashboard. So even though it's distributed, it's all an integrated dashboard. So we have one common view of everybody's security posture. And that was because when Congress gave us the money, they said, we want you guys to have a little accountability that you're getting the outcome that you're supposed to get on. Which was an interesting challenge, but it turned out we might be the only consistent monitoring and reporting tool that exists within the federal space on the civilian side. Sort of a happy circumstance. The other part that was recognized is that originally we had the dashboard that was sort of defined to be a place to bring things up. We rapidly found out that we wanted to be able to do the bringing of things down. You want to do the next slide?
Sure.
So to do all of this, we basically said, we probably ought to have an architecture. So now you're going to see a departure from any way you might have previously worked with the government. I came from the other side of the world. I basically built version 1 products for multiple decades. So I tend to have a high degree of confidence that the commercial space and commercial products oftentimes understand better solutions than something that the government could implement. So it turned out we did a COTS-based implementation. The intriguing part was we had originally only provided people with the requirements. Consistently, the answer that came back from the people who were bidding to get on our acquisition vehicle is they all formulated to the same picture as to how they thought the work should be decomposed. We took what we had heard back as feedback from the marketplace, and we formalized that into the actual government architecture. And the architecture turns out to be the first test you'll ever get from me if you say that you know CDM, because my first question is, can you draw me the ABCD architecture? Because I know of no other program that has something so simple that carries so much of what the program's intent is. But essentially what happens is we recognize that instrumentation of the environment is important. Getting instrumentation that's reliable, consistent, and scalable is one of the things that we go to, and if anyone who has ever offered products on our vehicle, they know that they have to fill out a questionnaire that asks you a lot of questions about, does your product do these kinds of things that show that you interoperate, you scale, you have a way of exporting data, as well as meeting our functional requirements of whatever you're doing in the functional area. We recognize that there is no general standardization of tools as for data models or other things that they do, sometimes because there are proprietary algorithms involved by the offerer, and then sometimes that's a differentiator. So what we did is we said there needs to be something that harmonizes all the information that you gather around an object that's on the network, unify that so it all associates to the right object, and collects the key characteristics that we want to have without all of the noise that might be coming from non-standardizing or normalizing the information. All of that is to feed the agency dashboard. Now, a convenient thing that happens is because we added in this integration layer, we do not preclude that integration layer from laterally communicating with other authoritative sources. Mostly we consume them, but there's nothing from stopping you taking the data that we have collected and harmonized and presenting that back to other usages beyond CDM. And as a matter of fact, the general rule that we do in evaluating products for CDM is we evaluate them based on our characteristics, but at no point in time do we ever request anyone shut off any functionality that that product might also offer. Okay, and hold on, back up a bit. So the other key is that, because I'm just going to give you a plug for you. So the other key is, it's nice that we took all of these dashboards together and they all go to one common reporting place. What we realized that cyber is very dynamic, and there is a lot of activity specifically done within our organization, inside of NPPD and CS&C, that we need to be able to formulate things, because things go bump in the night, for an unexpected query to have to be done. There are also other things where policy might need to get formulated that has to get pushed down to the agencies. So although most people think of us only having an upward path, it turns out that we do a downward path, and the work that we do with Martin's group would be one of the examples of where we take what they learn in evaluating of an agency to be able to formulate that into a set of requests to go to the agency as to how they should be formulating the response to fix. So it's basically, we have now created the dashboard, so it's a bidirectional communications link taking the federal requirements and observations and passes those down so the agencies can make a knowledgeable decision without precluding the agency of doing their own risk.
And so that structure actually then enables the what's a very large organization to be nimble. So when the WannaCry vulnerability, for example, comes out, this system could be used to determine how many instances of this, potentially are out there, how many, agencies could be impacted by it, and then also, really where to prioritize the remediation efforts. And hopefully, if you're doing automated vulnerability management, you're already patched.
You're already solved.
But today, imagine what goes on when you have to ask. You don't even know how many agencies.
You get the horrendous data call,
You
to
know,
which you don't know who wants to answer it.
So the idea is to really give us the ability to move a lot quicker to respond to changing conditions.
Okay, next slide. So here we go now into our phase discussions. So how do we break things down? So the first part of the question that we needed to answer is, what is on the network? Now, in order to be able to answer what's on the network, it was fairly easy to say that we wanted to know what hardware platforms you had. So what are the IP addressable entities that existed on your network? More often than not, agencies responded to, oh, the hardware that's on the network is the hardware that I know. Unfortunately, the bad guys say the hardware that's on your network constitutes an attack surface. So one of the things that came out very, very early in the program, and I think anyone who has worked on our Task Order 2, which is our first implementation of Phase 1, will say many agencies were very, very, very surprised when we started to do holistic discoveries of their network and positioning in a persistent way the ability to discover what were IP addressable devices that could then be used to categorize or classify those devices and then be able to determine which of those were under control, that you actually were responsible for making sure that they were patched, you knew the vulnerabilities, and you knew that they were properly configured. So the reason that HWAM sort of was like on all by itself is because the purpose of HWAM is really to delineate the attack surface. The items that are on the right are the items that we fully expect and would measure the agency as part of their security control activities, that they are actually executing, knowing what software is on the network, knowing that that software has proper configuration settings, and they know what the vulnerabilities are of those devices. The thing that this particular slide shows is that we're now used to only show what's on the left-hand side and said everything else is left as an exercise to the user. What we have now done is said, underlying the reason why we're asking this information is there's a fundamental data model of the information that we want to be able to gather to formulate this entire picture of your security structure. So the item that's on the right-hand side at the top basically is showing the representation of the conceptual data model that we would expect to gather, the core of which is called the master device record. So it says every device that you have, you should be able to collect or not collect its software attributes, its configuration settings, and its vulnerability. The bottom half basically shows that we have already started to do the mapping to the cybersecurity framework activities from NIST, because looking at the crystal ball, we're assuming that at some point in time, to go back to the chart that Martin was showing when we began, that risk framework and the cybersecurity framework are going to be things that we want to know, how are we solving those cybersecurity framework things, rather than enumerating all 170,
I think
850 controls.
I think we just got an executive order telling us.
And we just got an well, I sometimes do things long before the executive orders. They just sort of catch up with me. It's the reason for building version 1 products. You don't necessarily know what people are going to do until they get there. So this was the big question. I think the only thing that was really surprising on this is people have been, quote, doing this for 5 years. It turned out they were not doing it systematically. And it turned out it was spot instances of excellence. The one thing that the Cdm program did bring to the agencies is they realized that they had to have a departmental focus. So even if they were federated, they still had to have everybody working towards the same objectives against the same criteria. So we were probably more successful in that part than in the others, because I did the original cost estimating, and I thought I was being pessimistic, and it turned out I was half optimistic. It turned out to be a much more lack of coverage than I had originally projected. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I can do the rest really fast. So phase 2 is basically saying, what do we want to do about people? Because if the reality is to be told, if you were to ask, what is the largest method by which bad things happen into your network? It's because some person does something much more than something did something. So we wanted to collect known attributes about people that we could track. Once again, we're creating a master user record, so every person has a known digital identity. We know that they've done their training. We know that they've been suitable. And we know what access controls that they've been given, which is the 4 characteristics we look at. Next. Now, phase 3 turned out to be not as easy as phase 1 and phase 2. It's not as clear cut. So there's things that happen. So the basic theme of phase 3 is what's happening on your network. But the first thing that we realized is for FISMA and for a whole bunch of other things, we kept saying, what's on your network? The difficulty is that no agency now lives in a space where they're completely isolated. So one of the first parts that we were doing in phase 3 was saying we have to take on the problem of boundary protections and what is this transition that occurs when I move from my interior to my exterior. So this was basically, and then even Bound itself turned out that there are multiple different diverse products offering different specialties looking at different parts of the boundary problem. So we had Bound F controls that basically filtered on network. We had some that were filtering on content method, be that web or database or other things. And then we had things which were doing it based on the data, doing things like data loss prevention. We also found out that the encryption part, there's been a whole move that we're all going to move to HTTPS, but no one has necessarily done the things that says, oh, by the way, you should probably make sure that you're not using self-signed certificates, because although you're using HTTPS, you haven't necessarily made yourself more secure. You actually have to be doing stuff. That's Bound E. Bound E basically says you have to do better management of encryption, and you have to be able to report on it. And then, because we like adventure, we also decided physical access control systems have been sitting out all by themselves for too long. They should get incorporated into the same controls that we're subjecting any other IT assets to. Next one. And you can skip that. That's just by showing that we have a data model.
All this?
No, so just that one stuff out. Okay, so the next part of phase 3 was really looking at what do I have to do to enable my environment to give me visibility as to what's happening. So this is where do I do the things that actually tell me what events do I want to do, what auditing do I want to do, how much logging do I have to have, where's my method of translating an event into an incident. All of that is all done within managed events. It also looks at the planning activities associated with contingency planning because the benign neglect that's been given to contingency planning has now been called out under risk management as a underdeveloped, underdiscussed area. So it's risen to the front, so we rose it to the front. On our point of view, the other part that was realized is we're doing all of this stuff, but eventually, in order to be able to achieve what was put in the risk management framework, we had to start doing how does what these actions that we're doing affect an 853 control? And that's the beginning of us doing ongoing assessment. So ongoing assessment is taking the things that we're doing as actions through CDM and translating those into an 853 control. Next. And this basically shows what the data model looks like. You notice data models start to get more complicated as you do more complicated activities. Where basically events occur, we translate it into an incident, we formally record that incident, and that's going to trigger work for the next one. Next slide. So the next slide is what's happening on your network, and this is the first time that we're actually going to branch out from just being an observer into potentially actually doing things. So this is saying, now that I've done the continuous diagnostics portion, do I have to more proactively do things operationally to do that mitigation. And mitigation is a lot larger than just applying a patch. There's a whole bunch of other things, especially if you're talking about incidences. So this now gets us into a whole bunch of capabilities, improving our ability to do auditing and make sure there's accountability for it, making sure that we're getting all of the system information that would allow us to be able to do the ongoing authorizations and be able to do real risk assessment. And the cybersecurity framework, you'll notice that there's a lot more of the blocks that we're now filling out, specifically in respond and recover. And next one. So, the last part of phase 3 is DBS, which is design and build in security. And this is going to be a very interesting one. So this is basically, we need to know better information about the provenance of the software that agencies have put on their environment. So it's nice to know what the package is, but it would be even nicer to know what are the elements that we use to build that package. You might say, why would I care? The reason that you might care is you could be using OpenSSL. I think we had something called Heartbleed that said, we really want to know who's using OpenSSL. It was not apparent because we didn't know the provenance of the tools that we were buying, which ones had that dependency. You could be using some other vendor that you're integrated in where it's not obvious that you've integrated it in, and now there has been a challenge associated with that particular library or that particular source. So that is basically the part that we're trying to do in design and build in security. One is to encourage agencies as they are building their own and doing their own integration, that they have tools that allow them to do code inspection and to be able to do items of that nature. Also allow them to be able to do content-based scanning as opposed to just CVEs, to be able to do CWEs. That all is incorporated into this design and build in security. And then we go to the next one. Okay.
And we go to?
I could have put on my face. I will tell you.
You did a great job, Jim. I don't think I've ever seen you do that in 30 minutes.
Oh, I can do this in 15 minutes if I have to. So the one slide that we didn't put in this one, which I should have included in, is there is an official slide for phase 4. So the official slide for phase 4 is a crystal ball showing the picture of an exploding galaxy and says there's new things that we have to think about and there's new challenges that are forthcoming. So if you were to think about it, the primary thing on the first slide, which showed the pie chart, basically says we know that one of the areas of security that everyone talks about but no one does anything about directly is what data is on your network and how is that data being protected. So one of the primary themes of phase 4 is to start doing that taxonomy and defining requirements that make more explicit where the data is. If you think about it, when you do the FIPS 199, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability don't really have much to do with the computing platforms. Probably don't have much to do with the people. But they have a lot to do with decisions that you've made by inference about the data that's being served or being used. So we know that that shift is occurring. There are also other paradigm shifts that are occurring. The most interesting one to me, because I was doing network in my prior career, among other things, is the software-defined perimeter. This is especially true with modernization. The thing that is very, very clear, and I think it was another side effect of discovery that we had by doing the phase 1 activity, is we have found out that many agencies, if not most, have a significant part of their infrastructures which are high risk because they're out of service, or they're using technologies that can't scale to the level that agencies need to be able to do. It was built on an earlier set of paradigms where you did rack and stack of a firewall in every enclave with an IPS or an IDS and a whole bunch. So you landed up having this rack of 5 security appliances that you serially went through. So that's not an effective method, but just basically that would be looked at as a north-south only design. We're realizing that especially for cloud and especially for building of new data centers, east-west or lateral communications and its controls cannot be ignored. So that's another potential area for phase 4. The reason why they're only potential is because my team has not yet written the phase 4 requirements. So we only know that there are areas of interest. It's quite possible as we do more exploration, we might find that there might be some other themes that are associated, but the biggest theme will be how do you protect the data?
So to conclude, and then we'll take a few questions if folks have them, CDM makes it easier to manage risk by helping you to prioritize the things that you want to focus on and make sure they're the most important things. And that's the structure of the data that's collected based on the tools and the collection system and the dashboards that are in place. I think that as we went through this, just because we did go pretty quickly through the various phases, maybe coming back to the initial slide where we talked about the various phases and what those are comprised of. They were organized to achieve particular security outcomes. The first phase is really focused on identifying what's on your network and managing the devices that are on your network. The second phase is organized around managing your personnel or your users and what they're doing with those devices in the environment. The third phase is we went through is fairly complicated as it comes to managing events, and it will probably go in a sequence. And then lastly, phase 4, it's all the things that I guess we forgot, and additional capabilities and maybe then some.
Things that we didn't want to talk about before. Unfortunately, people are dealing with a really core set. If you think about it, how long have people been doing FISMA reporting? Okay, the fact that the data was not accurate enough to be able to make decisions on is semi-scary. Now we have more accurate information. The HSPD 12 card was 2004. I think that more than a decade has passed. We didn't have any information about users. We had no reason to move people to strong authentication. Cdm program was an enabler to do that. So it's a little strange thing that a lot of stuff that OMB wants done, they sort of figure out how we can write requirements and how we can get Congress to do money for it. And unfunded mandates now become more universally possible. The thing that is an interesting challenge that's going to happen with phase 3 is it's less clear whether or not the things that we need to do are within the ability of every single agency to be able to be done, or whether or not you would do it for every single asset. So a lot of what we're doing in phase 3 are going to be called targeted opportunities. We're going to be looking for where an agency might have a particular set of assets that are at high risk and have a position that would make it highly possible that the threat to them is high, and we'll probably start prioritizing to that. So there is a shift in how we're doing our strategy as we go to phase 3, because Congress is not going to give us all the money in the world that it would need to solve phase 3 for everybody. And our mantra has always been fix worst problems first. The problem is not knowing where your assets and not knowing where your attack surface is a worse problem. So that's why we did some of this thing. And not knowing who's on your network is a worse problem if you don't know who's there. But now that we're doing things in phase 3, and especially in phase 4, you're going to see more refinement of characterizing which agency or which parts of agencies are going to get targeted to do, which is where we start relying on the activities that are being by Martin's team, because they have a way of figuring out who is going to be at the most risk just because of their exposure or other reasons.
So it has applicability to really any enterprise to
Right.
organize these tools or to deploy them in these to these particular objectives, and we certainly have a number of well-documented implementations out there for folks to look at. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the panel about how this is getting deployed out into federal agencies. But again, really applicable to any enterprise. You may already have these tools and just haven't thought about using them this way. But in phase 1 and phase 2 in particular, and mostly phase 3, we're talking about some basic cybersecurity tools and capabilities that have been available for a long time. They're just organized towards a particular outcome that really enables the worst risks to be managed in a priority way. So with that, I think we have time for a few questions. Do we have any questions, or do I have to go to my questions for Jim? Sir.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Not the first to say that. My name is Paul Drossi. I'm from OSI, Soft, the PI system. So near and dear to my heart, and I know to certain agencies' hearts that we work with, is OT, your operational technologies. We keep talking cyber. I know when most people think cyber, they're thinking IT networks. Are you doing something with your OT networks with regard to monitoring and mitigation as well?
That was part of what we found out was the transition, that it took a while for the agencies to realize that they did have some of these, they're called mission networks in government terms, but essentially they had these other networks that had not been part of their reporting. But when we started to talk about attack surface and the fact that there might be lateral attacks or attacks coming in from other parts, so we actually are working with the agencies.
So
Some of those might not
these
get addressed.
DCSs, things like that?
Yep. So one of the parts that was interesting was agencies discovering exactly how many things they had on the network that they didn't realize. VA didn't really fully understand all the medical devices that they had, which have now suddenly moved from being isolated things to now they're actually sitting on a wireless network. So their discovery, their numbers jumped up to a 6-digit value.
We find that all the
Very,
time.
yeah.
All the
Yeah.
time.
And so
within
that's
this
part of it. So
specific agency's work.
SCADA, so there's a whole bunch of stuff, which will be activities that's why I said things like phase 1, we might have to start creating like vulnerability classes for these other devices, because most of the vulnerability stuff that we've done has focused on workstations and servers and not other classes of devices like VoIP or ICS or other types of things.
Yeah, I've got one intel agency that just realized, if their ICS is hacked or something goes bad with that, then they're just a building.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's something you should consider.
It's definitely a coming thing.
Excellent.
And I think that that's the thing that people have to realize is that with cyber, you're going to have to do progressive answers that fixes the things that you said you've been trying to do but haven't been doing to the newer exposures.
Hi, I'm Bob Lenahan from Cormax, and I was wondering if you could point us to any guidance about, raining on the parade when you come in and you do your penetration test and you expose the fact that it's an old version of SQL, or they have just bought this wonderful product, and you go into a bit of a cycle on what happens next. And is there any guidance to what happens next when you're in those projects?
Right. So if I can reframe the question, so when you determine that you have vulnerabilities, what happens then? Or
I'm sorry. There's a package, a dispatch
Right.
system, whatever it is, but it's sitting on some problem software, some old versions, and you're between the manufacturer and all these people, and you're coming in to do your report. Any guidance on how to guide them through the repairs?
So there's really a couple of responses when you identify a vulnerability or a weakness. You can fix it, right? It's generally the path folks go down. You can mitigate in other means, other means to be even turning it off or removing it from the environment, or in some cases, because it's mission critical, you have to actually accept the risk, because trying to, for example, if you've got a satellite control system that's running an old operating system, bricking a satellite is very expensive, right? So those are the determinations. And again, it's great to have the slide up here. Kelly's here. We're using your slide wherever we possibly can. this is really where we want to get back to managing risk, right? What is the impact? How likely is it that vulnerability could be exploited? And if it did happen, what would ultimately be the risk, to your ability to conduct your business or, meet your mission? And that's how you make those determinations, because there's not always a clean solution. And I think that's part of having that good conversation, with your leadership, and amongst your organization as to, what makes sense and how do we go about, mitigating this in a way that is in balance with all the other priorities that go on in an organization. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and to sort of go with this, I think CIOs are going to have an interesting challenge when the Modernization Act passes and there's monies in that, because now they could look to the Modernization Fund as a way of solving things with their schools. We are now sort of rewriting the way that we've done business in the Cdm program to make it more feasible to rapidly add on resolving for a problem, and to be able to do agency-funded, DHS-funded, or a hybrid on the problems. So we're trying to sort of remove the nemesis which has always been there, that having a 2-year planning cycle to solve a problem that you have today is probably not a good place to be. So we're actually trying to work. We don't know how much of what we're doing is going to be affected by the Modernization Act, because the wholesale replacement of infrastructure is probably not something that we're going to do, because, as I say, we're looking at targeted problems to get solved in a targeted way. So there'll be some level of interactions between that funding and ours. But we fundamentally know that there's things that have to be done once something is discovered to not treat the problem with benign neglect and do things more actively.
This is TJ Tejali. I'm from On System Logic. Is this better?
Mm-hmm.
TJ Tejali from On System Logic. It seems to me that the accuracy of the whatever situational awareness is there that your system shows is based on the accuracy of the sensor that you're receiving. So where is in this framework any notion of I can trust the sensor data based on whatever endpoint I may be receiving it from? For example, I think gentleman on my right said that WannaCry is one of those things as to this kind of system would be very useful for, and I can tell you for a fact as to if our government were going to be doing something, the part of the government that wrote those attacks, you wouldn't know anything about that over here, because as far as the sensors were concerned on those systems, they would have been reporting absolutely good sensor data, meaning the ability to run whatever code the adversary wanted on the endpoint would have made the sensor data useless to the people who are looking at it. So again, my suggestion to you is that if that is not part of what the framework addresses, it absolutely should be, because depending on where the data comes from, the amount of really trust you can have in it is, changes quite a bit.
So there's probably a two-part answer to this, but I think the first part of the answer is that the division that I work in at DHS used to be called Federal Network Security. It was the name's been changed to Federal Network Resilience, and I think that there's an answer in there that you can't protect against every last outcome, and so you also have to design systems that are resilient to attack, that can recover quickly, that have the ability to continue to even work in a degraded manner. So one of the things that we want to make sure that we stress when we're building and engineering systems, and Ron Ross and Kelly have a great document that they just released, System Security Engineering 800-160. I encourage folks to take a look at that. Talks exactly to that end about how you go about designing resilient systems. Jim.
Yeah. So I think that one has to get to the fundamentals. 0 days are always interesting. I'm a former academician. I just love those theoretical questions. The real problem is that people aren't doing basic hygiene. So it doesn't take a whole bunch to crack anybody if they haven't been doing fundamental things. So the first thing we have to do is solve those fundamentals. And then the other thing, like I was saying, for the design and building security, is actually to start having knowledge that you aren't picking up code that's from a suspect source or a non-validated source. And there will always be 0 days.
Yeah, I'm not
because
talking
that's-
about, look, I'm not talking about theoretical over here. I'm talking about reality that has just happened over the last
Well,
few days.
theory is sometimes reality.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that we have to solve the 80% problem before we get down to the 1%
And I'm saying is
problem.
that there are solutions out there for the 20% problem that you can look at right now. So I think I just suggest you, and I expect from my country to be looking at every solution which is out there to take away the 20%, because all you need is 1% to take over stuff. Not, you have to
Sure.
be,
Yep.
the guy who's
Sure.
coming after you has to be right 1% of the time to make these systems useless.
And we are, but I think one of the things that to provide a little context, from a federal enterprise perspective, we're establishing a minimum set of security controls that are going to be in place in a consistent manner across federal civilian agencies. There's additional protections that agencies or specific missions are likely to apply above and beyond the things that we're talking about deploying. But your point is certainly well taken, and we do. We probably have one of the largest concentration of cybersecurity experts, at least in our Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, and there isn't a vendor for cybersecurity products that every one of those people doesn't hear from all the time. So there's certainly a process for them to get in front of us. We had somebody phoned in a question for you, Jim.
That's good.
How is CDM addressing the introduction of IoT?
Well, first of all, IoT is not an introduction. So you will now go back into my history, okay? Because in 1985, when we were establishing the Enterprise Management Association, we actually did SMTP for a toaster. So, Internet of Things has been around for a long time. Benign neglect of too many things that were on your attack surface was
physical security systems.
like
for
physical
example.
security systems, for example. Yeah, so it's basically, and I think that was sort of like the part that we came to as a cognition within the Cdm program. Somewhere along the line, we made the transition from you had to only report on the things that were FISMA visible, which was workstations and servers and maybe network devices if the IT guys really felt like the Microsoft guys and the Cisco guys don't talk to each other, kind of deal. So we're now realizing that there's a lot more things that were coming on. And talking to the agencies, they realized that they had to change their security posture, mostly because there was now market visibility of this thing that was called Internet of Things, which said you had to be IP aware. That's all that really said. It's existed for as long as I've been doing network, which is 1970-something. So it's not that it's unusual, we just increase the scope as more things become addressable.
The scale and magnitude are creating increasing complexity in IPv6 and all that,
Right.
changes the way
That
we have
was
to
the
look
whole
at it.
rationale that we had when we built IPv6 is we said eventually there will be more things and we want to count grains of sand. So we'll create an addressing space that allows us to count grains of sand.
So we have a couple minutes left, and it looks like Dave Waltermeyer would like to ask a question.
Yeah, actually, it was part question, part statement, I guess.
Did we misrepresent the risk management framework?
No. I think
Okay,
it's
good.
great. Actually, the one thing I wanted to compliment you guys on, so Dave Waltermeyer, I'm the lead of the SCAP project at NIST, the Security Content Automation Protocol, which relates to a lot of the phase 1 activities that you guys are doing. The previous question was about this lying endpoint problem and the fact that, how can you trust the information that the endpoint is telling you about itself? I think that's the wrong way of looking at the problem. In order to catch the endpoint in a lie, you have to first make it lie about itself, right? You have to first make the endpoint misrepresent its current state. And so by having the endpoint report its software load, its configurations, if the endpoint misrepresents that, you should be able to compare that against other sources of information that you're gathering on the network. Your IDS information, other boundary protection kinds of capabilities, and you should be able to use that to actually catch it in that lie. take a printer as an example. Printers should not be opening web resources. So if your device is saying that it's a printer and yet you're seeing it open Internet Explorer, you know that it's not acting like a printer anymore. And so by taking this sort of multifaceted approach that you guys are taking to monitoring, you're able to actually address that problem in a much more robust way than you can do by simply looking at a single point of data collection.
Yeah, and to go to that, Dave, the reason that we started to create the master device record and the master user record was not just simply to aggregate the static information on those devices, but to be able to use that as a point of correlation such that if you were looking at things coming out of a boundary, you could say, is the system as it's presenting itself and the system as it's recorded itself officially matching?
That's right.
And I think somewhere in phase 3, we're probably going to get the question of at what point in time do you actually start testing through pen testing or through other mechanisms as part of the automation to validate that security posture?
Yeah, that's great. So I did have one question though. So in working with agencies and deploying phases 1 and 2, you've probably learned a lot of lessons about what's working and what's not. What are your plans as far as going back and revisiting the approaches that you've taken with phase 1 and 2, to address some of those lessons learned?
So I actually think that's a great question for the next segment, which is the panel. So if we can hold on that
We
one.
can hold on that one.
I think it will be nice to get.
I have more questions than answers on that one.
Well, it'd be good to get some thoughts from the users and some of the other folks as well. We had one last question, and again, like, we'll do a short 5-minute break, and then we'll just go straight into the panel. We're not going to let anyone get up.
No.
Okay, perfect. So the last question, Jim, how does CDM aid agencies to address vulnerabilities if it is a dashboard? Does it collect the data and send it back to the agency for resolution?
So it's an interactive thing. The reason that we created Layer B is not just a data aggregator, it's also a workload orchestrator. So it allows you that if you detect a vulnerability, it can trigger the remediation. You do not have to go up to the dashboard. So the structure is basically that the orchestration of work, the orchestration between tools is all occurring at that B layer. There can be things that you see in the dashboard, which in turn could point out to a problem that might have not been caused in B, in which case then the C layer will send something down to the B layer and says you have to take an action. And similarly, if we saw something at the federal level that says we're seeing a problem that should have been resolved by the agency, the federal D level will send it down to the C level will send it to the B level, and then the orchestration of the solution is done. So that's why you can't lose track of the fact that it's a bidirectional activity where we're expecting sometimes in order to figure out which problem to fix, you need to know where the data is that actually can identify that problem.
And this was done specifically to allow agencies to have their own risk tolerances.
Right.
So agencies may want to patch things more aggressively, or they might want to have a lower level of tolerance for deficiencies than the federal standard that is getting set at the federal level dashboard. So I think we were going to. We had 25, 35 seconds left. Okay, all right, perfect.
So you have to get up because you're not
I
allowed
have
to sit
yeah,
anymore.
I'm not allowed to sit anymore. Yep. Thanks, everyone. Let's get everybody set up. You can put Rod right here.
There's Eric's. You can sit. Here's Kelly's. Good. She's a long-standing friend. He's here. He was sitting in the back. Maybe he ran away when he found out the audience. So this is actually the first time we've been in battle for all of the collisions that we have had.
Where's Eric?
Force go.
Hi.
What's that? Yeah, good. Let's roll.
We could all make up answers.
So we're at the second point. Can everyone hear through the microphone? Is this working? So we're at the second part of the program where we thought that it would be very helpful to bring up a panel of experts to talk about their experiences with the CDM solution and also their experiences working with us as we establish this as a federal civilian agency approach. So we've got representatives starting with Rod Turk, who's the acting CIO at the Department of Commerce. Of course, I mentioned Kelly Dempsey, who works in the Computer Security Division at NIST and is one of the main authors of the publications that we're talking about. You can't hear me at all, right?
I don't think they can hear you.
How about I do that?
Better.
All right. So, so again, Kelly Dempsey, the Computer Security Division at NIST, which issues the standards under FISMA that federal agencies have to comply with. Of course, the incomparable Jim Quinn, the lead CDM architect. And then we also brought in a representative from one of the vendors that is deploying this as part of the CDM solution that is being deployed by integrators. And the structure of the CDM solution as it gets delivered to agencies is there's an integrator who pulls together a bunch of security products to build the ABCD diagram that we had in the previous presentation. So Eric Floden from Forescout, which is a hardware asset management solution, as well as some other capabilities, which you'll probably tell us about, is here with us as well. And so I'm going to give each of the panelists a few moments to introduce themselves and to describe their relationship to CDM and how they see CDM supporting and benefiting their mission. So, Rod, would you like to kick it off?
So I have a question first of all. Can I take this with me when I go? I just, you know.
I think that's mine.
Oh, well, there's another one down there. I wouldn't want to take yours. That's
There's
for sure.
another one at the end.
I'll save
Yeah, I
one
mean,
for you.
Maryland Cyber Warrior. That would be so cool on my desk at work. You know, at DC, I will be the envy of the office, I'm sure. So, yeah, I'm Rod Turk. I'm the acting CIO at the Department of Commerce. It's really, really interesting to be here because I've never been here before. And as the acting CIO, that's probably a mistake on my part. But I've heard a lot about the NCCoE, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about CDM. And hopefully at some point I'll be able to come back and maybe take a tour and talk to Donna Dodson and talk to some of the smart folks that are out here. I've been at the Department of Commerce off and on for the last 11 years or so. Started at the Patent and Trademark Office, came to headquarters as the Chief Information Security Officer in 2012, did a short stint at the Department of Energy as the Chief Information Security Officer, and then came back as the Chief Information, don't ask what happened. And came back again as the Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Commerce. And on the 20th of January at 12:01, I became the acting CIO. So it's been a wonderful ride. I was taking a look the other day, and not to coin a term, but I figured that I probably should look back and see what my 100-day accomplishments were, given that the administration was doing that as well. And quite frankly, we're moving out in a lot of areas at the department when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to IT, lots of different things going on. But I will tell you that at the department, and as the CISO during my day job, the CDM program is the centerpiece of what we're doing in cybersecurity at the department. So those of you from NIST, if you didn't know that, I'm so sorry. You should have known that, because we are depending upon NIST to do a lot of good things for the CDM program. And in fact, here at NIST, well, there at NIST, the endpoint managers for the CDM program, and the centerpiece of the CDM program is hosted at NIST. So this is truly a shared service for us at the Department of Commerce. We're pushing out significant capabilities for asset management, software and hardware asset management, and vulnerability management at the Department of Commerce. And the status right now is that we are completing our program, our pilot program, and we expect to have our authority to operate from NIST here within another couple of months. We do have some clients that we have to load on the high-rated systems at NOAA. But once that's all completed, we expect to be baking a full cake when it comes to the CDM program, and we're excited about that. Lots of other comments I could make on CDM and commerce in general. I'll reserve those for later because I don't want to give all my answers to your questions before you ask them to me, Martin. So I think that's about it. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Kelly?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Dempsey. As Martin said, I'm on the FSMA team, so I work with Ron Ross, and we write all the publications that stem from the requirements from FSMA, the Federal Information Security Now Modernization Act, and which the primary tenet is to put protections in place that are commensurate with risk. So all of our guidance is centered around that and risk management, and figuring out how to manage risk, not just doing a checklist, but let's look at what our risks are and manage it appropriately. So, and CDM comes into play. So meanwhile, well, one of the steps in the risk management framework is monitoring. And so we wrote Special Pub 800-137 back in 2011 now. I can't believe how long it's been already that pub's been out. And that is a publication that describes how to develop a continuous monitoring strategy, how to put a continuous monitoring program in place. And so then I ended up working with CDM staff at DHS. So I've been involved with CDM and monitoring really from the start. And I've also worked with DHS staff on a NIST IR, which is hopefully going to be published this week. It's very close. I'm having a little trouble when I try to convert to PDF. The tables aren't behaving, but once we get that sorted out, it's ready to publish, and it's NIST 8011, and it is about ongoing assessments, how to automate ongoing assessment, and it's aligned with CDM. It's aligned with all of our other special pubs, 137, 853, 837, and so I hope everyone ends up finding that helpful, and that's it.
Okay, and I'm Jim Quinn, so the part that we didn't tell you before, is I didn't come to the government until 2002, but when I decided to come to the government, I decided to take on a really easy problem. I was the chief architect, the initial chief architect for DHS, to which about a week into the job I said, why did I do this? Because there's a lot of unclarity in the government. And I had originally done it because I had lots of experience in doing international engineering. I said, government cultural problems have got to be easier rather than working around the globe. No. And then I moved from being the chief architect to I actually was the CISO for enterprise services. I've been a chief technology officer. And now you notice that I'm a very clever person, that I am only mission-oriented on one program. The part that causes people to question is after multiple decades of doing large-scale system engineering, why did I get associated with an acquisition program? And the answer was every time I went to solve a technical problem, they said if only someone would go and fix the government acquisition process. So you can't do that to an engineer. So the other comment that I will make is anyone who ever reads who has the tolerance to read our current attachment ends, which is 400 and some odd pages right now, will notice that you'll always find a very close alignment to the NIST publications, to the language that we use. That's completely intentional. We try to look at what NIST is writing, and we try to say, pragmatically, how can we actually build things that execute off that guidance, and how can we move closer and closer to where we all want to get in doing the risk management framework kinds of activities. So there's always been a very close linkage, and part of the way that we decided to progressively move stuff out in the phases was really based on we had to have better understanding of what those frameworks were doing and what was the knowledge that we could build. So it's always been an ongoing thing. The thing that will have everyone really excited is that we have now taken the 400, almost 500 pages of requirements, and we've now reduced it to 2 volumes. The first volume says, this is what you should be looking to get to. So that's our desired state. And here are the different frameworks that you can use as a point of reference of how to get to a desired state. And the second one, which is only 40 pages long right now, is the actual functional requirements. So essentially, we took almost 500-page document, synthesized it down, removed overlaps, consolidated everything, cross-referenced back to whatever we needed to do and not duplicate, and basically came out with an 80-page document, which is the requirements for all of the phases right now. When we do phase 4, we'll probably add another 20 pages on. But that's the correct way it's supposed to work, right? We're supposed to reduce the number of pages. And most of that's because we can reference back to NIST documents and say this is in accordance with the guidance that's in the NIST documents. Derek?
Thanks, Jim. My name is Eric Floden. I'm with Forescout Technologies. As Martin mentioned, we are doing HWAM as part of the Cdm program for the majority of federal departments and agencies that are participating. I've been involved with Cdm since 2012. The original BPA was competed in 2013, and I worked on that. It was eventually a program manager for one of the integrators that competed the program early on, and then joined Forescout about a year ago, and so I've seen this program from a couple of different perspectives. I'd make 2 points about CDM from my perspective over the years. And Martin and Jim tend to be modest and don't want to talk about this, but I think it's important to know that they've done with CDM something that's kind of revolutionary. The first is moving risk assessment and from a sort of static, maybe annual FSMA-based paradigm to something that's continuous, right? Every 72 hours there's a scan, results are pushed up to the dashboard, and the expectation is that when this is all fully functional and operational, every 72 hours you'll be testing that baseline against the previous one. And this, if you know anything about sort of the federal government, how it addressed IT security risk, is a much more rapid pace than what it was or has been over many years. And so in that sense, this program is somewhat revolutionary. The second point I would note is that the way that tools and services to address all of these different areas that Jim and Martin talked about are being acquired is much different than how it was done prior to CDM, right? Departments and agencies like Commerce and others would identify their requirements, and then they would solicit against those requirements, and they would do that, on their schedule, and they would do that individually. And as you heard, there's somewhere over 100 federal departments and agencies all doing this concurrently, right? But CDM changed all that, right? They got the power of Congress behind them to give them money to acquire a baseline solution across most departments and agencies in the federal government, and that's changed fundamentally the approach to security within the federal civilian enterprise. So if you're not in the federal space, you're not familiar with the program, I think those are 2 really important things to recognize. That the approach of CDM has been how it's been very different, and that that approach kind of explains some of the other elements around CDM as well, which we can get into. Namely, it's taken a longer time than most people have wished or hoped for it to roll out, but that is largely due to the approach that they've taken. It's been very different. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. So why don't we get down to it? First question. Rod, how is CDM going to help you manage cybersecurity risks? I mean, that's really at the heart of what we're doing here.
Yeah.
How is this going to help you?
So there's several things involved in that, and of course, in phase 1, when we take a look at hardware asset management, software asset management, vulnerability management, having visibility into those areas is going to be tremendous. It's going to be game-changing. I will tell you, though, that one of the things that I'm seriously looking at is the volume of data that's going to be presented when we start flowing information from our components up to the centralized endpoint managers. it's going to be a tremendous amount of data. And it's just not going to be data about, you know, the information that's going to flow to the dashboard. There's going to be other pearls of wisdom in there that we just don't know about. So what I'm really excited about is as we get more mature into this process, I'm looking for innovative approaches as to how we can use that data, mine that data, and find things in that data that will even more so provide us with a higher level of cybersecurity. I worked at the Department of Justice for a little while, Department of Energy for a little while. And one of the things that I found at Energy that they were doing very, very well is that they were taking a lot of that data and mining it, normalizing it, and using it to such an extent that you could actually immediately define the state of affairs across the enterprise to a much, much deeper level than even we had envisioned with the Cdm program. But I think there's also another unintended consequence, and it kind of plays off of a previous comment. Really, the Cdm program is one of the first enterprise services, shared services, in the federal government. And so what that's done for the Department of Commerce is that it's really kind of broken the ice amongst all of our CIOs, that they realize now that there's a benefit to working together. We have a very diverse, those of you from Commerce, you know that we have a very diverse set of functionalities. I tell people that we have functionality from the surface of the sun to the bottom of the ocean. And then on a horizontal plane, you know, you got census, you've got you know, NIST and standards, you've got PTO for patents, trademarks. I mean, it is a wide set of very diverse functionalities. But one of the common themes here, though, is cybersecurity. I mean, cybersecurity. Functionalities may change, but cybersecurity is kind of the same. There might be nuances here and there, but it's kind of the same across the enterprise. So what we're looking at then is the ability to take that thought and then consolidate the cybersecurity program throughout all of the Department of Commerce. So one of the things we've also done in addition to CDM is that we are going to take the feeds from CDM and send it to our Enterprise Security Operations Center. And so I mentioned earlier that NIST is going to be the endpoint manager for the CDM program. NOAA, we have co-located our Enterprise Security Operations Center at Fairmont, West Virginia, where NOAA has their SOC, and we are layering on top of their SOC the feeds from all of the components within the department. So to include the CDM feeds. So the idea here is that not only will CDM feed that presentation for cybersecurity, but we're also taking the other tools that we have in our enterprise and feeding them into our Security Operations Center as well. And the idea then is at the end of the day, we have a consolidated picture of what the Department of Commerce looks like. So not only has CDM brought us their enterprise services through their processes, but we're also layering that out to things like our Enterprise Security Operations Center. And we're doing that in a number of areas as well, other areas. So the unintended consequence is that we've kind of broken the ice for collaboration, for doing it in such a way at the Department of Commerce that all of our CIOs are working together. And I'm sensing a greater level of cooperation and collaboration within this Department of Commerce than I've seen in the last, say, 10 years. So I think that is a direct result of what the CDM program has brought to us.
And I think we just got an executive order on shared services, too.
Well, we're ahead of that, I got to tell you.
Did any of the panelists want to comment on that, on how valuable CDM is to the organizations, any of the value that you all are seeing?
Yeah, I think it goes with what Rod said. So I think that, I don't know whether they were unintended consequences, but they were not necessarily consequences that were obvious when we were launching things. We were hopeful that it would have some of the organizing principles, but it turned out that it was one of the better things. It also was turned out that the complexity of executing the task orders turned out to be a little bit more, when I was actually doing the cost estimating, I sort of looked at all the agencies, and based on my experience with the agencies and other things, I had sort of worked out complexity factors for agencies. Some agencies I came pretty close on being able to say they're going to have this level of problems because of the complexity. There were some agencies that we maybe a touch over-optimistic on. And it's turned out in the fullness of time that some of those agencies are much more difficult to get to an organizing policy principle with themselves.
I'm not going to ask.
Well, but certainly something that Rod mentioned as he was talking about, it opens the door for a lot of other kinds of capabilities. For those of you that are not from the federal world and you don't really understand when we talk about FSMA and OMB and budgets and all that kind of stuff, the program itself is structured to be consistent with the authorities that DHS has, which are in cybersecurity specifically to be assisting agencies. But what Rod's understanding is that this data that the agencies now have as a result of that effort can be used for other purposes. For example, just general asset management, right? Knowing what you have in your environment and where it is. There's a lot of effort that goes into just identifying where assets physically are and do we still have control of them and all that kind of thing. That's not necessarily in the scope of the CDM requirements that used to be 400 pages and are now 80. But
He did say so far, though. That's what I'm concerned about. He said so far.
Well, that's
but
like
it opens up a world of possibility for using that data for all kinds of purposes that would be beneficial to the NCCoE.
Martin, if I could jump in there since
Sure.
you wandered into my lane a little bit. From our perspective, as we have dropped appliances into environments, and then customers have been able to see assets that they thought maybe were there but weren't 100% sure were on their networks. That increase in data and that increase in capability from our perspective and from our customer perspective has been huge. Knowing that you have X amount of software licenses or X amount of pieces of hardware in your environment, and then being able to make decisions based on that, because you have a clearer understanding of what they are and what they're doing and how they're operating in your environment, gives you the capability then to realize the legitimate ROI on an investment you've already made, right? So if you know that you have 500 software licenses and only 10 people use that license on a monthly basis, right? You can then make a decision long range that you don't need all 500, or if these assets are only being used once or twice a year, then you can make decisions like that. So I think CDM has had unintended consequences that are very real. I think the data that is being provided is somewhat terrifying on some level, but data is not a bad thing. Data that you don't know how to use is a bad thing, right? And so these agencies that are going to be able to take advantage of CDM and the type of capabilities they now have are the ones that are going to be able to sit back and think, now that we have all these additional capabilities, how are we going to use them and how can we leverage this new capability? And I think that's been huge.
So I'm looking forward to what I would call focused risk management. What I mean by that is, as we get into vulnerability management, risk management becomes very, very important in that, you might be surprised the number of XP machines that you have out there. You might be surprised even about the NT machines that are still in the environment that are out of service life. Now, it's nice to know where they are. And so as we get into hardware and software asset management, in some cases you may not be able to remove or replace that vulnerability. But what you can do is you can reduce the risk. You can put controls around that particular machine or operating system, and because of those controls give you a greater level of assurance that your cybersecurity posture has increased. We in the Department of Commerce have a lot of one-off code. The Patent Office, the Trademark Office. There's no other United States patent office other than the one in Arlington, Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia. And so a lot of the code that is developed for the prosecution, if you will, of patents is one-off code that we write ourselves. But in some cases, there's hard-written things in that code that cause us issues. So that when you need to, remove or replace a system that operating system that has gone out of service, sometimes you can't do that elegantly without opening up the code and rewriting it. So you need to be able to identify where those are. CDM is going to help us do that so that we can then go in and put controls in place that will reduce that risk.
So, I think if you remember the chart that we had up here with the risk management framework, in CDM we've gone way into the weeds on what's in CDM and how it works and how it's a benefit to agencies. And just that focus on the sixth step of the risk management framework, monitoring the controls that are in place in your environment. There's so much more in the NIST catalog. And you know, we really, you know, focus in on one of those areas. And Kelly, you know, can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, we've seen how NIST standards and the programs that we've developed as a result of those could be applicable really to anybody. But what else is there in the NIST catalog, and how could those be used by other entities that are not necessarily, you know, subject to FSMA but want to take get the benefit of the work that you all have done here?
Mm-hmm. So I think really, so NIST has numerous types of publications. We have our FIPS, our Federal Information Processing Standards, and those are really quite targeted at federal and are mandatory for federal use by FSMA mandates their use in federal agencies. And but even they are, I think, useful as a starting point. FIPS 199, FIPS 200, FIPS 199 talks about how to determine impact level, and these are things that you can call it by different names. You can look at it from different perspectives, but you still need to take that time to determine, using risk assessment, what your impact level, what would be the impact to your organization if you lost confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a given system or type of information. So all of the guidance, while it's geared towards federal, it's definitely can be applied to any type of organization or sector or system. And our guidance has been developed purposely to that end. And so, but besides the FIPS, we have our special publications. And I think right now we're up in the 190s. They're not all active, but there's probably a good 130, 140 special publications out there. Some of them deal directly with risk management, like the ones that we developed for FSMA. And I mentioned Special Pub 837, which defines the risk management framework, and we have pubs that go along with that or help with certain families that are defined in Special Pub 853, which is, of course, our catalog of security controls. And so, for instance, there's a contingency planning family. We have a Special Pub 834, which is a contingency planning pub, how to do contingency plans. And somebody mentioned contingency planning was maybe a weak spot. And so anyway, if you need to learn how to do a contingency plan, we have a whole publication on that. And that, again, can be easily used by any type of organization. Another one we have that applies to a whole family, we have the configuration management family of controls in 53, and we have Special Pub 800-128, which is about security-focused configuration management. And so these are just some ways where risk management is always the focus, and it's also tied into the other publications. And then there's a whole host of other publications that, of course, my team doesn't work on, that many other teams work on. Dave has his SCAP suite of publications, both special pubs and NIST IRs. And then we have a lot of publications around cryptography, key management, lots of cryptography. There's probably about 20 or 30 cryptography-based publications that, again, can be applied and used by any organization. So, and then our NIST IRs. So we have the FIPS, the special pubs, and the NIST IRs. And the NIST IRs are interagency reports, and they tend to be focused on a very technical, drill down type of information. And there's a whole lot of those, hundreds probably of them, tackling various subjects. So I would just encourage anyone, no matter what organization you're from or what sector you're in, to go out to csrc.nist.gov and take a look at all the publications that are out there that you maybe didn't know about, that I think are very useful.
There's great flexibility and adaptability.
Very
built into
great.
the
Yes,
approaches.
all of the pubs
So-
are easily, that's what I mean, they can be applied to any size organization, any type of organization, any sector, any type of technology. I mean, some of the pubs are focused on a particular technology. I know there's one pub on Bluetooth implementations, but most of our pubs and certainly our risk management FSMA related pubs are designed purposely to be flexible and scalable and applicable to any type of organization.
Thank you, Kelly. So Eric, and I know we talked about this when we talked about what we're going to bring up here as questions during the panel, and it was really intriguing, the experience that you're having meeting not only with your federal clients, but also with folks in state and local government as well as in private sector. When you talk to IT leaders outside the federal government, specifically state and local governments, what are their impressions of CDM? And to what extent is the CDM approach appealing to them?
Most of them don't know about CDM, to be quite honest.
So we're trying to fix that here today a little bit.
Yeah, these events are very helpful. They have a high operational tempo in the state and local governments, where they're dealing with the same issues that the federal government is dealing with in terms of attacks and vulnerabilities and just managing and growing their networks and going to cloud and doing all these different types of things. So there's no one person that's responsible inside of their organization for looking at what the federal government is doing, drawing best practices, things like that, right? So they'll brush up against CDM when they go to a national conference or something like that, and there's a speaker there from DHS and they talk about it. What intrigues them about CDM typically when they learn a little bit more is pre-vetted solutions, right? As Jim was saying, there's an approved products list. There is a list of vendors that build solutions, and they have them ready and on the shelf that can be adapted to their organizations, and it's the combination of both tools and services together, right? Because they'll often have, from industry, they'll often have a services provider come in and say, you know, we can do everything, and then they'll have a tool vendor come in, and all tool vendors come in and say, you know, your problems have been solved the moment I walked in the door. Congratulations, all you got to do is just buy our tool, and we'll take care of everything. And the notion that DHS and the federal government have gone through the effort over many years to vet out solutions, to build solutions, and then now are deploying solutions, gives them, intrigues them, and gives them some potential promise that, you know, there's something out there that they might be able to tap into and be able to use. It may not be exactly right for their environment, but then again, the federal government's certainly not a one-size-fits-all, right? You've got departments and agencies that are as large as the VA and DHS, and as complex as those types of organizations. Commerce is a good example, and then very small micro agencies as well. So if DHS can fit those and deploy solutions to those different varying agencies, then it might be able to work for a large state like Texas or California or a small county, right? And so that's when I talk to them about CDM, that's kind of where they, you know, their ears perk up and they begin to think that maybe it's something that they can approach. And then to my original comment, they have the same similar problems, right? And so they realize that, you know, the threat environment moves quickly, but they don't move quickly enough to adapt to that, right? So the fact that CDM has kind of changed the paradigm at the federal level to be, you know, every 72 hours, right? Continuous monitoring of a network as opposed to annual compliance, that is potentially valuable to them as well. And so it's those types of things. But to be honest, and I spend a lot of time in the state and local as well as in federal, we just need to do as a community of people who are interested in working on CDM a better job of just getting out there and talking to them and explaining to them what the beneficial outcomes are of this type of approach and why they should be interested.
Yeah, and I think DHS certainly is committed to that. That's one of the reasons why we're here, and we're doing a lot of other outreach through the state and local partners as well. So we're going to do one more question for the...
Before you do that, so the one thing that I since I talked to a lot of state and local as well as other places, and I've even talked to DOD on this one, is one of the unintended consequences that we didn't understand the full import was that little clause that said we could buy on behalf of agencies, and the fact that we could build a centralized acquisition vehicle that could buy for a diverse set of people. It was whoever in Congress thought about it, they should get multiple gold stars, because that was the one piece of innovation in the acquisition process that allowed us to sort of break the logjam. And when I've talked to state and local, we have basically said, if you really want this to work, you have to figure out how to be able to get some sort of centralizing authority that can be a clearinghouse for the acquisitions, because otherwise you're going to be at the same spot we were in before we did the Cdm program and making so little progress, because there was no focal vehicle that could get people to say, this is a focused set of things for cyber problems.
You almost went in to answer the question I was about to ask.
Well, I don't know what your questions are, so I can't tell you that.
So we're gonna ask Jim one more question, and then we're gonna open it up to questions from the audience, and I'll sprinkle in a few of the additional questions I have here as well. So, as the CDM lead architect, what were the greatest challenges faced designing the CDM solution that others could take advantage of by adopting CDM?
I thought I understood the government by having been in the initial part of building DHS, and then I found out that DHS was not unique. DHS is probably more typical than I thought. As a matter of fact, I would say DHS is an archetype of almost all of the other agencies that I have seen, and that there wasn't this common purpose and other things that would drive anything together. And I think the other thing is that we didn't realize, although people had commented that acquisitions was a problem, that no one should do an acquisition of this type without having a strong technical team, because this is not a contractual problem. This is a problem that requires very careful crafting of the technical outcomes that you want to have, because we could have put together a high volume, lowest price LPTA, the regular way that we would do things in acquisition land, and we would have gotten products at a reduced price, but it would not have solved the problem, because it wasn't getting the best price for the product. It was getting all of these different things to work together harmoniously to be able to understand how are each one of these things contributing, and to go with what Rod identified. Part of what we realized is and it's sort of like the understanding that people have to have, is we do a lot of things to enable agencies to do things. The problem is that where we can invest our monies to ask our integrators to do things, their primary task is to integrate to CDM purposes. But we leave behind a lot of breadcrumbs that allows that, having built that repository at level B, we're all for the agencies figuring out ways of exploiting that. That's part of the reason why we took all of the stuff coming from the sensors and made them more persistent by creating the repository.
So to support this conversation, it might be good to pull on that thread a little bit and leverage Rod's experience. This is a little off topic, but for those that aren't aware, there are a number of federal agencies that are very large and very federated, meaning they've got individual components that do their own missions, and they even have separate funding streams. And as somebody who leads the IT for one of these large federated agencies, generally, talk a little bit about some of the complexity in performing that work and working with those different teams and different missions.
Wow. So here's the interesting thing, and I know I'm going to make a point here, and it'll make sense when I get to the end. In my CIO shop and my CISO shop, I want a very diverse workforce. What do I mean by that? If I had an office of 50 cybersecurity PhDs who are computer scientists, I would say that I'd get nothing done. And here's why. In the environment that I live in, I need to have people who can write, who can talk, who understand finances, who can do a business case, who can explain to a CFO why I need to do penetration testing, for example. And if I get into the bits and the bytes and I'm down at in the grass level, the CFO is not going to understand it, and I'm not going to get funded. Simple as that. So what that means then is that I have to have this diverse group of folks, and this applies for the CDM program as well, because those breadcrumbs that Jim talks about do need to get taken care of. You have to have the little nuances of the CDM program taken care of and funded so that you can be successful. But what that means is you got to be able to explain that to people so that they understand why that's important. They need to understand that you've made previous investments in the past, and in order to make those investments successful, to include investments from DHS, you've got to be able to explain that in a written way, in a spoken way, in any other way that you can think of, so that you can get the funding and that you can develop that cybersecurity culture that's going to make this successful. Because, if we do CDM, even if we do CDM and everything is in place where we're feeding the dashboard, but we're not using the tools in the many ways that they can be used, we have not succeeded in the CDM program. So there are other things that we need to do in a CIO's office and in a CISO's office to be able to make sure that we're using those tools and the data that results from those tools in such a way that it significantly enhances our cybersecurity posture. And that goes back to the diverse office, to be able to pull all of that together in a cogent way that can make sense to the non-technical individual.
Thank you, Rod. It's very helpful. In the room, do we have any questions for the panelists? I think we've got one up here. We got two up here and one over there.
Hello, I'm Brandon Glenn from Amazon Web Services, mainly for the people within the government. What have been the biggest challenges with CDM with more agencies moving into cloud environments?
Deferral. So anyone who looks at the requirements that we did in on task order 2, which was our first answer for, this is the advantage of having a system engineer be the person who describes the work. The two things that I realized when we were starting to do this in 2013 was the maturity of how agencies were going to use the cloud and the maturity of how agencies were going to manage their mobile assets were not sufficiently solid for us to be able to justify doing an investment. So this is the strange part. I came from the commercial side. I mostly worked on building version 1 product, and therefore I'm used to working with venture capitalists. So this sort of goes to what Rod says. When we were doing the program, if it was not cost justifiable to get the result that we thought, we deferred that work. We just said we're not ready for it. What the good news is that what we're now thinking is in the 2018 timeframe, especially if the modernization funding comes in place, we expect that there's going to be an escalation, and there's now enough information on how we can do a cloud reference architecture to be able to start doing things. Now we have to start working with the agencies as to how does that come in and how is that going to appear relative to FISMA reporting of security posture. And there's sort of like an analogous problem that's going on with mobile that we sort of like need to do some sort of crystallization in a reference architecture that says how do we observe, because the riddle we now question for cloud is how do I actually accurately describe an attack surface in a cloud which is robust and is not tied to a fixed number of known assets because they're transitory. So that's part of what we're working on now is exactly how would describe the attack surface so that agencies know exactly the exposure that they have with using the cloud and whether the compensating controls are actually achieving that risk that that agency's taking.
And it's a common theme because I think we just got an executive order on that as well.
Well, I told you, I didn't write any of this stuff, but the advantage of having been an architect for a long period of time, there's certain things that you know are going to happen. The question is, how do you match that to the maturity of agencies being able to do it and justify making an investment?
Sir.
Standing back for feedback purposes. Mike Binko, CEO of CloudTrack. I love two comments first, the breadcrumbs and then also diversity. I would add on the diversity side from the staff internally on the agency, also have a diverse palette of vendors. Some of the smaller emerging innovators might have some solutions to the challenges that you're facing. And those breadcrumbs are often an area where they're willing to engage and bring a lot of resource to bear to maybe solve a problem on a start small and scale approach. Following on this question on cloud, obviously with DHS being one of the JAB agencies for FedRAMP, I'm surprised that question hasn't come up and I see the eyes rolling. But with agencies that may be ready to let ATOs with vendors that are in process on FedRAMP, how is DHS involved with the CDM program office with the FedRAMP program office to maybe combine agencies that are willing to look at those breadcrumb opportunities that may be right for cloud at a procurement level that may be below a competitive bid, even to try it out? Is that a possibility where DHS can work with the agencies in letting?
I think there are opportunities that are in there. We are actually taking the federal dashboard and for various and sundry reasons, we are going through the FedRAMP process. because it's a shared service that's being done, and we're trying. So part of what we try to do in the program is the fact that something hasn't been done before doesn't mean that we're not going to do it. So before GSA actually defined how to do a shared service, we already were working on how to do a shared service at a high level before there was a FedRAMP high level. So we're now going through and trying to find out the intricacies of doing FedRAMP, especially in the current constraints of the volumes and interpretations that are inherent in FedRAMP. So it's an interesting challenge because the cloud activities are increasing, but the bandwidth of FedRAMP approval and the speed of the process is not necessarily commensurate with what's going on there. But we also are in that same queue. So we're not jumping ahead of the line, we're not declaring a separate exception, because part of what we need to know as a program is exactly what the agencies should be encountering. But it is an interesting problem that I'm glad that I no longer have to work about because other people are worried about that problem now.
So Jim, you've got a lot of online fans.
I know I do.
I'm going to reword this question just a little bit to bring in some of the other panelists. But the question is, what requirements in CDM tooling provide the continuous aspect of CDM? Those tools do not interoperate in real time, and existing tool streams are full of false positives and noise. So I think to provide a little context to this, Kelly, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what is continuous monitoring, and then Jim, if you could pick up and some of the other panelists on how CDM is actually performing that continuous aspect. But first and foremost, start off with what our objective is that we're trying to meet.
Okay, so continuous monitoring from a NIST perspective and from a risk management perspective is to basically monitor the controls you've put in place to make sure that effectiveness is being maintained over time. So you think you have a certain security posture, you've implemented this set of controls that you've determined are the appropriate set of controls for to protect your information at whatever impact level you determine. And so now on an ongoing basis, and somebody mentioned the old annual process, and before that it was even less frequently the 3-year process, and we've been striving to move away from that sort of fixed time frame for a long time. And so continuous monitoring is what gets us there, and so that we're more or less continually looking at the effectiveness of the controls we put in place. Are they still protecting our information in the way that we thought they should, that we wanted them to? And so that's what continuous monitoring is meant to achieve, so that we always have a sort of near real-time status of what our security posture is. So if things are going awry in configuration management, or there's problems over with account management, or we're finding out that we're getting rogue devices popping up on our network, we find these things out immediately, if not sooner. And so 137 goes through the process of a management level process of how to put such a program in place. And then we have, as I mentioned, NIST 8011, which drills down into how you can actually do an instantiation of what's described in 137.
And certainly, Rod, you talked about how CDM was having an impact in your organization, but maybe specifically in this area, if you could talk about how it changes your day-to-day work and your ability to manage risk given the large enterprise that you have to keep track of.
Well, yeah, I think there's two aspects to that. First of all is the obvious. I mean, being able to identify vulnerabilities, rogue assets, those kinds of things is huge. That's huge. But that's today. What we really need to be thinking about in the future is how we use this continuous monitoring for machine-to-machine types of transactions, so that at some point when you find that you have a malware infiltration, that the machine-to-machine will automatically isolate, your architecture, isolate the device, and not shut it down, because a good forensics person will tell you don't shut the machine off, you'll lose a lot of data. But you want to isolate it so that there's no lateral movement. Now, of course, that also presupposes the fact that you've already segmented your architecture so that the movement of any kind of malware will be, reduced anyway. But the idea here, though, is that as soon as something appears, something that is untoward, and your SIM tool catches it, then having that machine-to-machine kind of activity where then you can, do the alerts, segment it, shut it down if you need to, I think is going to be huge because, as a CIO, what you worry about is when you have that day when that malware enters your system, it's going to try to move out through the rest of your architecture, right, the rest of your network. And you, in order to be resilient, like you talked about in your earlier panel, to be resilient, to be able to limit that damage so that you can maintain operations and keep your customers online. That's, I think, is where the future is going for this, and I'm looking forward to that day.
So I think, Eric, you have an opportunity to jump in here, too, about how the Forescout solution does look at the environment in a real-time basis and provide opportunities for risk managers to do their work much more efficiently and much more effectively.
Yeah, just 15 slides. That's all I got. So, monitoring your obviously your environment on a continuous basis is crucial, right? CDM attempts to do that, right? But then you come to, so we find a problem, what do we do now, right? And I think what Rod is getting to is, you need to be able to automate your response. You need to be able to be truly effective, to truly prevent lateral movement, right? You need to be able to have two different types of tools or solutions inside of your environment talking to each other, sharing information, and then be able to respond based on what's found in an automated fashion and not reliant on security staff. What's common across federal, state, local, you name it, whatever IT shop, even commercial, is the lack of a number of qualified individuals to operate, these tools, right? And so,
intrusion prevention systems in monitor mode.
Yeah, right. I mean, we see this all over, right? Where you get all this data and then something slips through because you don't have enough people, or it was at night and the staff was smaller, et cetera, whatever it might be, right? There's just not enough people, and so the next step is then, once you have all these systems and they're all talking together and they're all working together and they're working in a continuous fashion, is then to be able to automate response, right? That one tool finds this, the other tool finds this, they're aggregate in someplace else. You identify risk. That risk has to be acted upon, and that action doesn't have to sit in a help desk ticket in a queue, right, and wait for somebody then to get to it. That action has to be able to be automated within your system to be able to attack that problem immediately, right? And that's a little ways off, but we have to get there, right? I mean, that's where you truly become effective at securing your network. It's not a 100% solution, but that's where you have to get ultimately to be truly effective inside of your environment.
Thank you. So, Jim, what requirements in CDM tooling provide the continuous aspect to CDM?
Okay, so I'll give you another factoid. Okay, I'm a theoretical mathematician with a subspecialty in behavioral organizational theory. So I figured out how you get that combination as your degrees. I'm a diverse person. I actually have no formal training in computer science, which is very ironic since I've been working in this field for 40 years. However, the interesting thing is people ask, where did this 72 hours come from? And the 72 hours is a combination of what is practical to do in an organization that has not been known to be able to do 3-day responses.
Right, so CDM,
it's been working
CDM
on 30
scans
days.
every 72 hours.
Right. So the decision cycle of when you do things, now, as Eric is saying, and I think we all would like to be able to get to, is how do I know that this is an actually true device, true problem that I've detected? I have correlation by looking at multiple sensors to say this is for real, and I can actually automatically push the button that takes the item out and have a contingency plan or some other mechanism that says, I'll take a service reduction if I can't shut this down completely. That is going to take a lot of work. You can't do that until you actually understand. And to me, the fact that we have moved from every 3 years to every year to quarterly to every 30 days is completely commendable, but we haven't necessarily done the automation or providing the information knowledge that deals with it. So what CDM is trying to do is say our target is 72 hours of being able to see when something really happens, that you have the information to be able to make a decision and execute the resolution, because we can't quite get to automation yet. There's too many unknown things that we need to know about where is that system being used that we'll eventually get to. But there's a whole bunch of context that we need that eventually CDM will have. So, but 72 hours does make sense. That is called near real time, as Kelly said. That means that's about as fast as you can expect the government to do. And any of us who work for the government and produce papers for review will tell you we would love to have 30 days to get answers back on our reviews, because usually it's much longer than that. But, so that's the goal of the 72 hours. It did come out of some actual thought. It wasn't arbitrary.
Thank you. Did we have any other questions in the room? We've got time for one or two final questions. You've been very patient. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for your time and your comments. So Damon Cabanillas with Carbon Black. There are commercial capabilities in use today, and I'm wondering when those commercial capabilities will come in to the federal government. So for example, Rod, you talked about looking for threats in the data stacks that are collected. Cyber threat hunting is something that's done quite a bit in commercial. Carbon Black's a leader in that space. Endpoint detection and response, incident response, looking for non-malware, malware in those data sets is something that's been done for a couple of years now. I don't see that on the roadmap in CDM. Maybe that's in phase 3.
Actually, we actually have our governance document, which is OMB 1604, is that what it is? Is that the one that tells us what to do? So we actually have a directive from OMB that says what we're supposed to do. And one of the little footnotes that was there is we were suddenly going to magically figure out how to bring innovation into the government and allow the introduction in some very effective manner to allow us to build more responses. We are still working on methods of doing that, and part of what we're doing in the reshaping of how CDM is going to conduct its next round of business is doing things that would allow us to shorten that path. Unfortunately, there's only X amount of compression that we can do within the government until someone gives us a little bit more ability to be able to bring solutions in a known path to agencies that we can do in some fashion. Doing an innovation, which is a very strange thing to say, since I made most of my career in doing innovation, I have found the hardest thing to do in the government is innovation and process changing. It's the one thing that when I came in 2002, I completely underestimated that it would take the amount of energy that it takes in order to cause an innovation. But we are required, we've been given directions to do so, and we are all actively working on how can we actually do that and what things need to be done.
And to be clear, particularly within the NCCoE and US CERT, they do have hunt capabilities that we deploy to agencies, and agencies have those capabilities also. It's just not a part of CDM at this time. So there are those capabilities, they're just accessed in a different way. So I think we've come to the end of our time. I really want to thank everyone for their attendance and the folks online for hanging with us for 2 hours. It's a really deep topic, and there's a lot of ground to cover. We certainly would appreciate any feedback on the presentation itself from the audience. We're trying to get this message out there, and we're trying to do it in the most effective and efficient way so that others who want to leverage this solution and the lessons learned that we have can in the broader community. And especially I would like to thank the panelists who've taken time to come out. Rod and Kelly, Eric and Jim, thank you so much for your partnership and for coming out and sharing your subject matter expertise. It's always a pleasure. And with that, thanks for hosting us, Tim.
All right. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out, and I'd also like to mention that, the NCCoE itself is, a place where we do a lot of things very transparently, and you can engage with us as collaborating with us on projects, looking at more extensive partnerships, or even just participating in our communities of interest. You can do that by commenting on the things we publish. We're constantly coming up with new project ideas and sharing those very publicly, so you should always feel free to comment. And once again, thank you for coming out, and there's some refreshments in the back if you want to stick around for an hour or so.